We praise them for their talent, we put them up on a pedestal, and sometimes we even judge them for their life choices. Who am I talking about? Well, celebrities. Their lives are on full display for anyone to make an opinion on them. And often their rise to fame is very inspirational. One particular story which caught my eye is J.K. Rowling's, the author of the famous Harry Potter book series, which whether you've seen or watched, you most probably have heard of it. I was surprised to find out that J.K. Rowling's life wasn't all that glamorous before her books hit the stores. She actually found herself in dire circumstances. 3 years before the first Harry Potter book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, was published, she really struggled in raising her child on her own and in affording the bare necessities. She didn't have money for a computer or even to pay for photocopying her 90,000-word novel, so she had to manually type each version and send it in to the publishers. And there is no doubt that her books were a hit worldwide, but surprisingly, no one was interested in publishing her book in the beginning. Until finally, a small publisher in London, Bloomsbury at that time, promised to publish her book after the CEO's 8-year-old daughter fell in love with her book. And a few months later, that promise was fulfilled when the first copies of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone came out in stores. In our Bible reading today, we will look at a moment in history that happened thousands of years ago, but a moment that is still relevant to this very day. Similar to J.K. Rowling's story, God's people are in bleak circumstances until God intervenes and makes some remarkable promises. And thousands of years later, those promises are fulfilled in Jesus. We'll be looking at Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 7, and as I read it now, try and identify the 3 main promises that God makes to Abraham. Now let me read Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 7. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram travelled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moriah, at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord, who had appeared to him. Well, we have seen so far in our series that God created a good and perfect world with men and women made in his image. However, Adam and Eve disobeyed God's good command to not eat from the tree in the garden, and so sinned against him. They were banished from the garden and therefore from God's presence and blessing. And what follows is a downward spiral of sin and rebellion for all humanity. In just these 9 chapters since Genesis 3, we see families and nations rejecting God and trying to put themselves in God's place. Now the Bible draws our attention to Abram's family and the remarkable promises that God makes to Abram. And this takes us to our first heading today, God's amazing promises to Abram. God's amazing promises to Abram. Did you notice what they were? Well, God promises Abram a land, a people, and a blessing. A land, a people, and a blessing. And we will now look at each one in turn and see their significance. So firstly, let's look at God's amazing promise of a land. Let me read Genesis 12 verse 1 again. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." At Adam and Eve were banished from God's presence, and now humanity is living in exile. Remarkably, God makes an amazing promise here that instead of his people living in exile, God calls Abram and his descendants to a land that he will give them. And in Genesis chapter 12, verse 5, we find out that that land is the land of Canaan. Now the next amazing promise comes in verse 2. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. In the previous chapters of Genesis, we learn how all peoples on earth are scattered, nations are divided. But here God promises to build his people through Abram and to make them a great nation under him. So we've seen God's amazing promise of a land, God's amazing promise of a people. And now in verses 2 and 3, we see God's amazing promise of blessing. We have seen in Genesis 3 how God had removed his blessing from his people and cursed Adam and Eve. But here in Genesis 12, instead of curse, God will bless his people, and through them he will bless other nations too. God's promises are not just for the lucky few, but include everyone God created. And it's such good news for people across centuries and backgrounds that God had always had in mind to bring people from across the globe back to himself. Well, we can all agree that 2020 was quite a disappointing year for all of us, I'm sure. I don't know about you, but I was really looking forward to the Summer Olympics. I'm not a big fan of watching sports, but for the Olympics I'd stay up all night. It's so inspirational to see athletes persevere and to see them push themselves to the limits for their country. And there is one particular moment like this in the history of the Olympics, which was even referenced in one of Barack Obama's presidential speeches. I am speaking of one of Britain's most famous athletes, Derek Redmond, who was a world and European relay champion. At the 1992 Olympics in Barcelona, Derek Redmond joined in the 400-meter semi-final, and he was amongst the favourites for a gold medal. However, when he hit the 250-meter mark, he tore his hamstring. Now imagine how devastating that must have been for him. Well, at that moment, his father intervened and helped him finish the race. God also intervened when the odds were not in humanity's favour. He saw the desperate situation humanity was in and chose to step in for their good and for the good of all people throughout centuries and generations, including us here today. But there is one major difference though between Derek's story and the story that we read in the Bible. Sadly, Derek Redmond didn't win a medal in that race. In fact, it was his last competitive race. But unlike Derek's athletic career, God's amazing promises mark not the end of humanity, but the beginning of the fulfillment of these amazing promises through the one who is even greater than Abraham. These incredible promises God made to Abraham laid the foundation for what was to come in the rest of the Bible. The Lord never forgot what he promised Abraham, but he ultimately fulfilled them in the perfect man, his son, Jesus. And this takes us to a second point today. God's amazing promises fulfilled in Jesus. God's amazing promises fulfilled in Jesus. Years and years after God's promises to Abraham, we can look back and see how the Lord fulfilled those promises in the most remarkable way. Instead of giving up on humanity because of their sin and rebellion, he chose to intervene in Genesis 12. And thousands of years later, he stepped in as a man to bring people back to himself and to restore the brokenness of this world. If you need proof that God is faithful, that he is in control, well, look at Jesus. For all those promises God made to Abraham in Genesis 12 are accomplished by him. Think back to J.K. Rowling's story, how that promise for her book to be published was a game changer for her and for millions of readers around the world. The amazing promises God made to Abraham were a game changer for all humanity. God's promise of a land, a people, and a blessing were always meant to be a pointer to the restored and blessed life Jesus will give to his followers when he returns. But until then, believers are called to faith and obedience. Look at verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. Abram heard God's promises and he responds in faith and obedience. And for believers today, our hope rests on God's promises being fulfilled in Jesus. These amazing promises which are given to us through faith in Jesus. So as we finish, I wonder, is this your view of God? A God who doesn't tell us to sort out the mess of this world, but promises to do so himself. A God who promises game-changing grace to a world that turned his back on him. Do you ever wonder what God is doing in this world? Well, here in Genesis 12, we have the blueprint. We have seen God's amazing promises that he made to his people. And we also had a little foretaste of how Jesus might come to fulfill these promises. But how will all of this actually happen? Well, I'd encourage you to come back and find out more.